Sarah Brennan hadn't planned to spend Christmas Eve hiding in a feed mill with 20 terrified children. The lantern flame guttered against the draft, seeping through the warped boards, casting shadows that made the small faces around her look even more hollow. Outside, the wind howled across the Colorado plains like something wounded and angry. She counted them again, 20, all under 12 years old, most under 8. They huddled together on empty grain sacks, some still wearing the thin cotton shirts they'd had on when the Orphan train stopped in Belridge 3 days ago. Sarah pulled her woolen shawl tighter and tried not to think about how much trouble she was in. The feed mill belonged to the Hendersons, and they'd skin her alive if they knew she'd broken the padlock, but the alternative had been worse, much worse. 3 days ago, she'd watched from the schoolhouse window as the Orphan train pulled into Belridge Station. She'd seen it before, twice in the past year, watched well-dressed families from towns select children like they were choosing produce at the market. Saw the children lined up on the platform, inspected, judged. Some went to good homes, others didn't. This time had been different. Sarah had recognized the man coordinating the placements immediately, Cyrus Marks. He'd arrived in Belridge 6 months ago, calling himself a representative of the Children's Aid Society. He wore expensive suits and spoke with authority that made people trust him. But Sarah had grown up in New York, in the same neighborhood where her father ran a printing shop near the docks. She knew Cyrus Marks, knew what he really was. Her father had printed up wanted posters with Marks's face on them once, 4 years back, before the cholera took her parents, before she'd fled west to start over as a schoolteacher in a town small enough that no one asked too many questions about a woman traveling alone. Cyrus Marks trafficked children, not to families, to factories, mines, brothels. He used the Orphan trains as cover, forged papers, took money from the worst kind of people. And 3 days ago, she'd overheard him in the saloon, half-drunk, bragging to another man about the merchandise he was moving through. 20 kids, prime age, headed to a silver mine operation in the mountains right after Christmas. The real families who'd agreed to take children would get paperwork for different orphans. Younger, sicker kids he'd swap out last minute. No one would know until it was too late. Sarah had exactly one advantage. Cyrus Marks didn't know she'd recognized him. She'd waited until dark on December 23rd, 2 days after the train arrived. The children were being kept in a warehouse by the rail yard, guarded by one of Marks's men. She'd created a distraction, a small fire in a trash heap on the opposite side of the building, and led the children out through a back window she'd pried open earlier. Getting them to the feed mill had taken 3 hours of careful movement through alleys and behind buildings. Now they were here, cold and scared, and she had no idea what to do next. A child whimpered. Sarah moved to comfort her, a little girl with red hair and a gap-toothed smile who told her name was Jenny. "SHH, sweetheart, we are safe here." But they weren't safe. Marks would be tearing the town apart looking for them, and when he found them, he wouldn't just take the children, he'd make sure Sarah disappeared too. Boot steps crunched on frozen ground outside. Sarah's breath caught. She extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. The children went still, 20 small shapes barely breathing. The footsteps grew closer, deliberate, circling the building. Then a voice, low and cautious, "Anyone in there?" Not Marks. The voice was younger, rougher, Western drawl instead of Marks's clipped East Coast accent. Sarah stayed silent. Could be one of Marks's hired men. The door rattled. "Look, I saw smoke from your lantern through the wall boards. It's Christmas Eve and colder than a witch's heart out here. If you're squatting, I don't care. I just want to make sure nobody's freezing to death in my family's feed mill." His family's mill. Sarah's heart sank, not the Hendersons then. She'd gotten the ownership wrong. The voice continued, gentler now. "I've got no fight with you. I'm leaving a blanket by the door and some food. There's a barn about a quarter-mile west, red-painted, can't miss it. It's warmer there. Belongs to the Morrisons, but they're gone for the holiday. Doors open." Footsteps retreated. Sarah waited, counting to 100, then 2. Finally, she crept to the door. A wool blanket lay folded there, and beside it, a canvas sack. Inside, bread, cheese, dried apples. She gathered the children, and they moved through the darkness, following the direction the man had indicated. Jenny clutched Sarah's hand, and a small boy named Thomas walked so close he kept stepping on her heels. The barn was warmer, not much, but enough. Horse smell and hay and the lingering warmth of animals that had been kept there recently. Sarah got the children settled in the loft, distributed the food carefully, wrapped the blanket around the smallest ones. Then she allowed herself to breathe. They couldn't stay. By tomorrow, Christmas Day, Marks would have searched every building in town. She needed a plan, needed help. But who could she trust? Dawn came grey and bitter. Sarah had maybe slept an hour, slumped against a post, with 3 children pressed against her for warmth. She woke to the sound of the barn door opening. A man stepped inside, tall and lean, wearing a sheepskin coat and a hat pulled low. He carried a basket covered with cloth. When he looked up toward the loft, Sarah saw his face clearly for the first time. Dark hair, several days of beard growth, eyes that looked tired but kind. Maybe 30 years old. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Figured you'd take the suggestion," he said. "Brought breakfast and coffee." Sarah didn't move. "Who are you?" "Name's Daniel Warren. This barn belongs to my sister and her husband, but they're visiting her folks in Denver for the holiday. Whole place is empty till January 2nd. He set the basket down. "You going to tell me why you've got 20 kids hidden up there?" "Why do you care?" "Because I spent Christmas Eve watching Cyrus Marks and his men search every shed and cellar in Belridge. Because I saw the wanted poster for Marks in the sheriff's office last week. Seems he's got warrants in 3 states. And because I saw you at the schoolhouse yesterday morning, looking scared half to death." He pulled off his hat, met her eyes. "I'm guessing you know what Marks is." Sarah's throat tightened. "You saw the poster." "Sheriff keeps them in a drawer, not posted up. I do carpentry work for the office sometimes. Saw it when I was fixing the front desk." Daniel moved closer, keeping his voice low so he wouldn't wake the sleeping children. "Sheriff's on Marks's payroll. Half the town council too. They know what he is. They take a cut. You could be working for him too." "I could be, but I'm not." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, held it up so she could see. "Telegraph came through last night. Federal marshals 3 days out, coming to investigate Marks. Anonymous tip went in 2 weeks ago about suspicious orphan train operations." Sarah stared at him. "You sent it?" "Sister and her husband tried to adopt from the last train. Good people, wanted a child real bad. Marks told them no, said none of the children were suitable, placed all 8 kids with other families instead." Daniel's jaw tightened. Week later, Charlotte saw one of those kids working in the back of the butcher's shop. 10 years old, skinny as a rail, bruises all over. She asked around, found out Marks had sold 5 of the 8 to local business owners as labor. Other 3 disappeared entirely. Federal marshals, the only law that might actually do something. 3 days, Sarah said. "We don't have 3 days. Marks will find us before then. That's why we need to move you, all of you, tonight." Sarah climbed down from the loft, keeping her movements quiet. Up close, Daniel Warren looked solid, steady, like the kind of man who kept his word, but she'd been wrong before. "Where would we go?" "I've got a hunting cabin in the foothills, about 15 miles north. Remote, no one knows about it except family, big enough for everyone if we pack tight, stocked with firewood, some provisions." He met her eyes. "It's the best option you've got." "And what do you get out of helping us?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "My sister cried for 3 days after she saw that boy, hasn't been right since. This is the first time in my life I've had a chance to actually stop something bad before it happens." He glanced up toward the sleeping children. "That's enough for me." Sarah wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to, but trust had nearly killed her before. "I'll think about it," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I'll be back tonight after dark. If you're willing to try, I'll have 2 wagons ready. If not," he paused, "if not, I'll do what I can to help you some other way." He left the basket and walked out, closing the barn door quietly behind him. The children woke hungry, and cold and asking questions Sarah couldn't answer. She rationed the breakfast Daniel had brought, still warm biscuits, bacon, hard-boiled eggs, and tried to keep spirits up. But they were running out of time, and everyone knew it. Around noon, she heard voices outside, men's voices. Sarah gathered the children, moved them to the back corner of the loft, covered them with hay. She grabbed a pitchfork and positioned herself where she could see the door. When it opened, Cyrus Marks walked in. He looked the same as he had 4 years ago, well-dressed, clean-shaven, pleasant smile that never reached his eyes. 2 men flanked him, both carrying rifles. "Miss Brennan," Marks said, his voice echoing in the empty barn, "I've been looking for you." Sarah kept the pitchfork steady. "You know my name." "Of course I know your name. Took me a day to place you, but I remembered. Little Sarah Brennan from Sullivan Street, whose father printed up some very inconvenient posters once upon a time." He stepped further inside, relaxed, like he was taking a stroll. "You've caused me considerable trouble." "Good. The children are my property, legally speaking. I have contracts, paperwork. You've stolen them." "They're not property, and your paperwork is forged." Marks smiled. "Prove it. My contracts say those children were placed with families. If they've gone missing, well, that's kidnapping, isn't it? By you." Sarah's grip tightened on the pitchfork. He was right. He had the papers, the authority, the backing of half the town. She had nothing. "Here's what's going to happen," Marks continued. "You're going to tell me where the children are, then you're going to leave Belridge and never come back. If you do that, I'll forget I ever saw you. If you don't," he shrugged, "I have friends who can make problems disappear." Before Sarah could respond, another voice cut through the barn. "She's not alone." Daniel Warren stepped out from behind a stack of hay bales on the ground level, holding a shotgun. Behind him, 4 more men emerged from various hiding spots around the barn. Sarah recognized 2 of them, Morrison brothers from the ranch next door. The others were strangers. Marks's pleasant expression slipped. "This doesn't concern you, Warren." "It does now." Daniel's voice was steel. "You've got about 10 seconds to get off my sister's property before I start considering you a threat. I could have you arrested for interfering." "By Sheriff Palmer, the one who takes your money." Daniel took a step forward. "Here's the thing, Marks. These men with me, they're ranchers, they're business owners, they pay taxes, they vote, and they're all real curious about those federal warrants with your name on them." He gestured with the shotgun. "Now walk away." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Marks's mouth twisted into something ugly. "This isn't over." "Yeah, it is." Marks left, his 2 men following, but Sarah saw the look on his face as he turned. This was far from finished. After they were gone, Daniel climbed up to the loft. "You okay?" Sarah nodded, though her hands were shaking. "How did you know he'd come here?" "I didn't, but I figured if he was smart, he'd search every barn and outbuilding in the area, so I asked some friends to keep watch." He glanced toward the hay where the children were hidden. "We need to move, now, before he comes back with more men." "It's not dark yet. Someone will see us." "Can't be helped. Marks won't wait for nightfall, and neither can we." Sarah made the decision quickly. They had no other options. "All right, let's go." Getting 20 children into 2 wagons without being seen was nearly impossible, but they managed it with blankets and tarps covering the wagon beds. Daniel drove the first wagon, Sarah the second. The Morrison brothers rode alongside as guards. The journey to the cabin took 5 hours on frozen roads, moving slowly to avoid attention. By the time they arrived, full darkness had fallen and the children were exhausted. But the cabin was solid, 1 large room with a fireplace, a sleeping loft, a root cellar. Daniel had been here recently, firewood was stacked high and the place was clean. They got the children inside, started a fire, distributed blankets, and what food they had. Sarah moved through the chaos mechanically, making sure everyone was warm, that the youngest ones felt safe. When everything had finally settled and the children were asleep, Sarah found Daniel outside, checking the horses. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel turned. In the moonlight, his face looked different. Younger. Don't thank me yet. We've got 3 days to keep everyone hidden and alive. Why are you really doing this? Sarah asked. The truth. He was quiet for a long time, his breath misting in the cold air. Finally he said, my parents died when I was 8. Cholera outbreak, same one that probably took yours based on the time frame you mentioned. I ended up on an orphan train with my sister. She was 6. We were lucky, got placed with a good family here in Colorado who treated us like their own. But I remember what it felt like, standing on that platform, knowing your whole life depended on which stranger decided to take you home. He met her eyes. These kids deserve better than Cyrus Marks. Sarah felt something in her chest crack open. My parents died the same way. I was 16, old enough to work, not old enough to inherit my father's shop. The landlord sold everything for back rent. I had nothing, no family, no money. She wrapped her arms around herself. I came west because I couldn't stay in New York. Too many memories, too many people who knew I'd failed. You didn't fail, you survived. Is that what this is? Sarah gestured toward the cabin. Surviving. No, Daniel said. This is fighting. There's a difference. They stood together in the cold, and for the first time in 3 days, Sarah felt like maybe she wasn't carrying everything alone. The next morning, Christmas Day, dawned clear and brutally cold. They kept the children entertained with stories, songs, games. Sarah taught them a simple tune her mother used to sing. Daniel carved small toys from scrap wood with his pocket knife, horses, birds, simple figures that made the younger children smile. But beneath the forced cheer, tension ran like a current. Every sound outside made Sarah flinch. Every creak of branches in the wind sounded like footsteps. On the second day, one of the Morrison brothers came with news. Marks had left Belridge with 6 men, heading north. They were searching the foothills systematically, checking every cabin and shelter. How long do we have? Daniel asked. Day, maybe 2, if the weather holds them up. That night Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat by the fireplace, watching the flames, trying to figure out a solution that didn't exist. If Marks found them, he'd win. He had the guns, the men, the law on his side. The federal marshal wouldn't arrive in time. Daniel sat down beside her. You're thinking too loud. I don't know what to do. We keep them safe. That's all we can do. It's not enough, Sarah said. The words came out raw. It's never enough. I watched my parents die. I was 16 years old and I couldn't save them. I couldn't save our home, our shop, anything. All I could do was run. Her voice cracked. And now I've got 20 kids depending on me and I'm just running again. Daniel reached over and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, warm. You're not running, you're protecting them. That's different. What happens when Marks finds us? Then we fight. We can't win that fight. Maybe not, Daniel said quietly, but we can make sure those kids know someone tried, that someone stood between them and the monsters. He squeezed her hand. That matters, Sarah. It matters more than you know. She looked at him and saw something she hadn't let herself see before, not just kindness, but understanding. He knew what it was to feel powerless, knew what it was to survive when you didn't want to, and he'd chosen to fight anyway. I'm scared, she whispered. Me too. They sat together as the fire burned low, hands linked, neither of them alone. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, December 27th, Cyrus Marks found them. They had maybe 10 minutes warning, a rider from town who'd followed Marks's group and raced ahead. Daniel and the Morrison brothers grabbed their guns. Sarah gathered the children in the root cellar, a space barely big enough for all of them. She wedged herself at the top of the narrow stairs, holding a rifle Daniel had given her. Stay quiet, she told the children. No matter what you hear, stay quiet. Then she closed the cellar door. Above, she heard boots on the porch. Marks's voice, loud and confident. Warren, I know you're in there. Send out the children and the woman, and we'll call this a misunderstanding. Daniel's voice was steady. They're under my protection. You're not getting them. There are 7 of us, 3 of you. Be reasonable. Being reasonable is how men like you keep winning. A shot exploded, deafening in the small cabin. Sarah flinched, heard scrambling above, Maury shots, shouting, the sound of furniture breaking. She gripped the rifle and prayed. The fight lasted maybe 3 minutes, but felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, Sarah didn't know who'd won. She heard heavy footsteps on the floor above, moving around. Then the cellar door opened. Daniel stood there, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, looking exhausted. It's over. Sarah climbed out. The cabin was destroyed, broken chairs, bullet holes in the walls, blood on the floor. One of Marx's men sat tied to a post, looking dazed. Another was being held at gunpoint by the Morrison brothers. The rest had fled. And Cyrus Marx lay motionless near the door. "Is he?" Sarah started. "Dead," Daniel said flatly. "He drew on me, didn't give me a choice." She should have felt something. Relief maybe, victory, but all she felt was tired. "The marshal arrived this morning," Daniel continued. "One of the Morrison brothers rode down to meet him, told him everything. He's on his way up here now with federal deputies. It's finished, Sarah, really finished." The children emerged from the cellar slowly, frightened by the destruction but unharmed. Sarah counted them again, all 20 safe. Jenny ran to her and Sarah scooped her up, held her tight. "You kept us safe," Jenny whispered, "just like you promised." Sarah closed her eyes and let herself cry. The federal marshal arrested Marx's surviving men and took statements from everyone. The children were placed in temporary care, with families the marshal personally vetted until permanent arrangements could be made. Sarah's testimony, combined with the evidence they'd gathered and Daniel's witness account, was enough to bring charges against Sheriff Palmer and 3 town council members. It was over, they'd won. But in the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself unable to settle. She returned to her schoolhouse, tried to resume her old life. But the classroom felt too small now, too quiet. She'd spent 3 days protecting 20 lives, and going back to teaching grammar felt meaningless. It was mid-January when Daniel found her sitting on the schoolhouse steps after class, watching the sunset. "You're leaving," he said. "It wasn't a question." Sarah nodded. "There's a new teacher arriving next week. Woman from St. Louis, experienced, better qualified than me. I think it's time I moved on." "Where will you go?" "I don't know, maybe Denver, maybe further west. Somewhere I can," she paused, searching for words. "Somewhere I can do something that matters." Daniel sat down beside her. "What if you stayed?" "In Belridge. With me." Sarah's breath caught. She turned to look at him, saw the hope and fear mixed in his expression. "Those 3 days in the cabin," Daniel said quietly, "I saw who you really are. Not a teacher, not someone running from her past. Someone who fights for people who can't fight for themselves. Someone brave enough to risk everything for what's right." He reached for her hand. "I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose you." "Daniel, I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other, but I've never been more sure of anything." His voice was rough with emotion. "Stay, help me finish what we started. There are other kids out there who need protecting, other fights worth having. We could do it together." Sarah thought about the past 3 months, about hiding in a feed mill, about 20 scared faces in the darkness, about the moment she decided to stop running, about Daniel standing beside her with a shotgun, choosing to fight even when the odds were impossible. "I'm not easy to love," she said finally. "I have nightmares. I don't trust easily. I've spent 4 years keeping everyone at arm's length because it felt safer than letting anyone close." "I know," Daniel said, "and I don't care. I've got my own ghosts, Sarah, my own nightmares. Maybe we can face them together." She looked at him, this man who'd saved her when she'd been out of options, who'd stood between 20 children and a monster without hesitation, who'd seen her at her most desperate and never once looked at her like she was broken. "Okay," she whispered, "I'll stay." The kiss was gentle, tentative, like they were both afraid it might shatter, but when they pulled apart, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Spring came to Colorado with wildflowers and warming winds. Sarah and Daniel were married in April in a small ceremony with the Morrison brothers as witnesses and 10 of the orphans in attendance, the ones who'd stayed in Belridge with adopted families. Jenny threw flower petals and declared the wedding the best thing ever. They bought a small ranch outside town and started talking about adoption, about building something permanent, about all the children who still needed someone to fight for them. On their wedding night, lying in bed in their new home, Daniel asked, "Any regrets?" Sarah thought about the girl she'd been 4 years ago, alone and desperate in New York, thought about the woman who'd hidden in a feed mill with 20 stolen children, thought about all the versions of herself that had led to this moment. "No," she said, "no regrets." Outside, the wind moved through the prairie grass like a whispered promise. Somewhere in the darkness, 20 children slept safely in homes where they were loved. And in a small ranch house on the Colorado frontier, 2 people who'd survived their worst nightmares held each other and dreamed of better things. The secret that had changed everything wasn't about the orphans or the fight or even the victory. The secret was simpler than that. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop running. Stand your ground. Let someone stand beside you. And fight.